Welcome to the Protection Pros podcast, brought to you by CPPS, the leading provider of workplace violence solutions. I'm your host, Stacey Brown. Join us as we explore the world of security leadership through the lens of the pros who live it. All right, Dave, I'd like to take a moment to kind of explore your background in protective intelligence and kind of the genesis behind threat assessment, threat awareness, and kind of dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So as I mentioned earlier, this whole concept of behavioral threat assessment and management really had its genesis in a concept called protective intelligence and investigations. And while that term has broadened now to be an entire security program under my good friend and colleague Fred Burton over at Ontic, and I don't disagree with that, its real genesis was, it's kind of ironic. When I was a diplomatic security agent, I actually taught a course called Sources and Methods of Assassination.
Really?
I always thought we should have changed that title a little bit because I have to tell people it's not a how-to course, okay?
Right, yeah.
The bad guys have that course, but this was kind of how to recognize the behaviors and how to recognize and respond to those things. And even though it was in like foreign officials or politicians or high-value individuals, this really is where we got our genesis. I mean, I don't want to go do too deep a dive, but it goes all the way back to the days of John Hinckley Jr. and the Reagan assassination and Mark David Chapman and the John Lennon assassination, where we had just brilliant practitioners, two of which were Weil and Boskul, who really wrote this book and determined that certain behaviors were more likely to have someone go on a pathway or a targeted act. Mm-hmm. And even though they were looking at individuals that were serial killers, and you might say, well, you just said earlier that profiling doesn't work.
Right.
The behavior piece transferred over. So it was interesting and kind of how that kind of worked. And so some of on the government side, it was the United States Secret Service, and followed by my organization, the Diplomatic Security Service, because we do the vast majority of dignitary protection in the federal government, came up with this concept. And it was really a situation of someone makes a threat or has made a series of threats. Mm-hmm. What is the difference between making a threat and posing a threat? And we saw this in another great book I would recommend, Hunters and Howlers, with Calhoun and Weston. Anybody can make a threat. I always say talk is cheap. We still pay attention to verbal threats, but it's verbal threats coupled with wherefore, ability to carry it out, and other environmental factors that are much more likely to come to fruition if you're going to have a targeted attack. And so the way it used to work, at least in the early days on the government side, is that let's say the President of the United States is coming to Philadelphia. And the local Philadelphia field office agents would go out and what I like to say is interview the usual suspects, right? The people they knew were on there, people that maybe had some mental issues or had made threats in the past or whatever. And this is back in the days, Stacey, where we carried pagers. There were no cell phones, and we had 3x5 cards that we indexed on all the people. So they would go out and talk to everybody that they thought might be a threat. And as you might imagine, we are not a developing world country. We don't bring everybody in and arrest them simply because the President of the United States or the Secretary of State is coming in, but they're kept an eye on, right? And you have that interaction. That was all part of protective intelligence and investigations. And it used to be very, very close held. So the Secret Service worried about their own protectees, diplomatic security worried about their own protectees, the Capitol Police, whatever that might be. And then there was the fateful day where they had an individual that had made a threat to the president. They went and talked to him, standard protocol, and they came back with the following assessment. Yes, if he has the opportunity, he will try to kill the President of the United States. But because he doesn't live where the president is or is nowhere near the president's going to go, we think it's a low threat.
Interesting,
right? You would think, yeah, that's quite riveting, except that he hopped on a train one day and came to Washington, D.C. And fortunately, the Secret Service had be on the lookout for this person because he was, pretty aggressive in his threats. And when the metal detector went off at I believe it was the West Portico of the White House, they recognized it as possibly being him, and he ran away. They couldn't get him. Well, because that information hadn't been shared with anybody, he went up the street 3 hours later. He got into the Capitol and shot and killed one guard and wounded a police officer.
Really?
And that was a real wake-up call for everybody in the community. You got to share this stuff, right? If they're threatening against the threats against the president of the United States, who else might be at risk, right? So this was all part of this learning process within protective intelligence and investigations. It wasn't just one protectee or one event. What I did at the Olympics and what many of us did was really protective intelligence of a large national security event, which is what they call it now, right? Mm-hmm. It's designated as such. And there's certain precautions that we take, but on the protective intelligence side, we're still looking at behaviors, what people have said, what they've done, where they are. Those were all the predicate for modern-day behavioral threat assessment and management. And we learned the hard way that profiling didn't work well. I alluded to the Olympic Park bombing. Profile got the wrong guy. Took us several years to get the right person. And then we had the Murrow Federal Building in Oklahoma City. And sadly, you can't be in this business as long as I have and not talk about how you got it wrong. Mm-hmm. And so I was at a counterterrorism conference in South Florida, and my pager went off again, a long time ago.
Yeah.
And it was our headquarters, our command center, saying that the Murrow building just got blown up. And because I was considered a subject matter expert even back then, and because I was at this event, I immediately got crowded with, what do you think? And without batting an eye, with a straight face and just full of conviction, I said, this has all the earmarks of Middle Eastern terrorism. Oh. Except that it wasn't, and it didn't. It was a sovereign citizen who was angry about what happened at Waco, had issues in the military, and was looking to get back at the federal government, and that's why. So there was twice we missed the mark, the royal we, on this. Right. And so for me personally, on the federal side, we recognize that intentional and targeted violence is a different animal in the violence prevention queue, if you will. Profiling is serial type crimes, murder, rape, bank robbery, tend to do it the same way, the same time, sometimes same type of victims. Sometimes they'll move around, but you have some consistencies, and it's almost looking for it after something's happened. One of the things that I love about behavioral threat assessment and management as a discipline is we're able to figure out or try to assess some of these things before it happens. And so, I cut my teeth in, protective intelligence and investigations. And so when I retired from the government, I was very fortunate to work with some really skilled people, former FBI one profiler, Gene Regala, who used to work with CPPS. Right. For some reason, he took a liking to me, and he kind of taught me what he knew. And then I got a chance to work with another legend in the field, Dr. Michael Corcoran, who was one of the founders of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, ATAP. And I realized the nexus between protective intelligence and investigations and behavioral threat assessment and management, and that it could, in fact, transfer over into other organizations or disciplines. And so that's kind of how it started. There was really I would say a early version of a threat assessment and management program at CPPS. It wasn't particularly well defined. But once Gene left and retired, Randy allowed me to kind of perfect that craft a little bit, and I studied and researched. And ATAP has a certification called the Certified Threat Manager, CTM, and that means you're trained in a body of knowledge, which means all of us that are CTMs are trained in the same body of knowledge to not only teach, but consult in this. And so this is kind of the progress. And there's a lot of other great steps in the way. And of course, tragedies move things forward like nothing else. Fred Burton always said it's nothing like a good tragedy to bring progress, and he's right. Oklahoma City, Columbine, Virginia Tech, Parkland, you name it, we've gotten better each time.
That's right, yeah.
But then, unfortunately, the perpetrators do. So the concept then with our program is I do two things. Number one, I do real-time threat assessment. That means we have clients, as you know, that call us. I like to say when people are behaving badly, right?
Yeah.
Because the challenge that you have is that some of the behaviors of concern, and those of us that are very well versed in workplace violence prevention and intervention, those behaviors are those behaviors that when clustered together bring a higher likelihood of violence. Doesn't mean it will, but it's a much better indicator than what we had before. Some of the same people that went on to become active assailants had the same behaviors. So you can't, here's my big speech right here. You can't have a workplace violence prevention program and not have a threat assessment program. They have to be part of each other. They can't be separate. Right?
Right.
And so that's really it. You get the information, what to report, where to report, who to report it to, get that information to a multidisciplinary team. And by multidisciplinary, I mean literally the people that are on that team or unit really should reflect the organizational culture and mission of that organization, right? But there are some key components: legal, security, human resources. I'm a big fan of including corporate communications. And then you add other people as necessary. Well, that does a couple of things. Number one, you just don't have one person that raises his hand and say, hey, I've done this for 40 years. I know what I'm talking about and you don't. This is what's going on here. You've got everybody with their biases and their biases and their experience and everything else coming together as a team and saying, wait a minute, I know about this person. They were a problem before. Or wait a minute, this could be tied into something that happened before. So the conversation that comes from it is much healthier. And you actually have a healthier and a more secure environment because you're able to assess things. Now, threat assessment and threat management, I said, we're not predictors. We assess the likelihood of violence. And then the threat management side is to come up with what we call intervention strategies. Simple. I'm a Southern boy. What are you going to do about it? When I did a lot of work in ministry security, one of my buddies came up with the term DLR. Very technical term. You may be familiar with it. Don't look right. But it don't look right. If it don't look right, what are we going to do with that, right?
Yeah.
And I've kind of carried that over with me. And is there a reason why it doesn't look right? Is there ongoing situations? So that's kind of the genesis of it. The training is, if I do say so myself, is rather intense. It's like drinking from a fire hose. But in the meantime, we're also training them as a team, the muscle memory to kind of get together. And I'll tell you, you have a much better chance of determining potential violence than you ever had before. We can't catch them all. We'll never catch them all. But from the courts all the way down have recognized that behavioral threat assessment and management right now, using what we call a professional structured judgment approach, is the gold standard. And so that's really kind of how it's happening. And it's continuing to evolve. I mean, to what extent you say, well, one of the things I think about when I come out to the inland Northwest or the Pacific Northwest is a large concentration of populations of indigenous folks that come with that. One of the things that we've learned, and I have colleagues that are from the community and they actually do threat assessment, you can't go into a reservation and call things the same thing you call if I go to downtown Spokane. Culture, bias, how they react to authority, all those things. So threat assessment is evolving. It's the same stuff. It doesn't change, but it resonates with people in different ways. And I think that's really cool.
Protect what you can't afford to lose with the Safe Workplace Suite by CPPS, the leading provider of workplace violence solutions. Empower your people, protect your brand, and align with standards. The Safe Workplace Suite includes everything your workplace violence program needs, like assessments, plans and policies, e-learning, instructor training, and behavioral threat support. CPPS is trusted by over half the Fortune 100 and endorsed by ASIS International. So visit safeworkplacesuite.com or check the show notes for more information. I would like to break that down just a little bit more, kind of simplify it a bit, just so people understand truly the benefits of these threat management teams and threat assessors. So basically we're empowering the individual, right? To
Correct.
see something, say something. So then let's say they report it to their manager. Okay. Now I did my due diligence, right? As an individual, I'm seeing some of these behaviors of concern, and I'm reporting it to my manager. But it's not even my manager's responsibility, right, to determine whether or not that's a credible threat or not. That's what we have these threat management teams for. And so these threat management teams now receive the highest level of training, and they can kind of dissect this. And to your point about hunters and howlers, that kind of leads us back to, we've heard that expression, all bark and no bite. Mm-hmm. And so it's, sometimes it's those that seem like, okay, maybe it's not credible or maybe there's nothing there. I'm not going to say anything. I'm sure they don't mean anything by that. And that's kind of what you mean by profiling as well. So like if somebody says something and I just kind of write it off like, no, they've never been in trouble. No, there's no way they would carry this out. I'm sure it was nothing, but it's just not sitting right with me.
And that's what we want. That's what we want. I mean, you can make your own value judgments. We all do that as human beings, but don't let that be your decision as a manager,
right,
or whatever. You need to do some investigation. You need to dig deeper. What's going on? And by the way, this is not a punitive discipline. This is about sometimes getting people the help that they need, right?
Excellent point. Intervention, right?
Right, intervention. And so the other thing to keep in mind, two of my pet peeves that I'll always welcome an opportunity to get off my chest, and that is the myth that these types of acts are almost always committed by people with mental illness.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So, number one, that's not true. Number two, mental illness is taken into account as part of an assessment that I do and my colleagues do, but it's only one piece, right? So, because the reality of it is, I'm not a psychologist and I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, but the reality of it is, most people with a diagnosed mental illness or undiagnosed even are no more a danger to the community than you or I. But it's when it's coupled with other factors, violent tendencies, isolation, environmental issues, changes in behavior, maybe trauma in their life, all those things. And then when you add things like access to drugs and alcohol and weapons,
right?
Now we have something that we can hold on to. So that's why when I consult with my clients, sometimes they get frustrated because I'll say, well, what do you have for me? Well, here's this person. He's angry all the time. And? Well, he's angry and he's scaring people. And we just keep going because it's this evolutionary process to go with it. And so one factor is no more important than the other, and that scares people. But the reality of it is I need to have the whole picture. They need to have the whole picture. And then we determine what's the likelihood that person is going to commit a violent act. Have they fixated on a target? Is there any planning that's been done? Is there any organization? The more planning, the more organization, the more finite the target, the bigger concern we have. So you see, it's not just and put it on the wall.
Right.
There's a process. The other thing that's important, Stacy, to realize, particularly because so many of our clients are corporate, there's a liability piece to this. Mm-hmm. We have to be able to articulate what we did, why we did, who we did it to. And with that, and I've been to court a couple of times now, you get the following question. Who are you? What's your background? What's your affiliation with this team, the client? How were they trained? All the way through, because there has to be a process. Personalities change, biases change, circumstances change, but the process can't change. And so that's where we kind of articulate kind of where we are, and then we have them break it down into a low, moderate, high, or eminent. And then there's components for that, which I won't do that deep dive for you, but it's quite detailed. But the more you do, the better you get at it. And having everybody in the organization understand that. You meant the supervisor. Well, what's the supervisor going to do? Sit with it? There's two kinds of supervisors in my view. One is thinks it's their job to know everything and do everything, and it's a sign of weakness if they share that. That's not what we're looking for. Mm-hmm. We're looking for ones that understand, hey, this may be nothing, as you said, but this is unusual behavior. And we have that kind of information. And then when you add in law enforcement colleagues and mental health professionals and healthcare groups, it goes back to that my dream of someday having truly, community threat assessment programs.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the trend that we're seeing now. I know a lot of states, even for school districts, they have threat management teams, right? Because a kid maybe, would exhibit some behaviors of concern or get moved from different homes or different communities, and then that information would get lost.
Yes.
And now they're sharing that between these districts, and they're able to track it and provide intervention, like you mentioned. I think that's so incredibly important. But I really want to stress that us as individuals, it's not our jobs to assess it.
No.
It's for us to give it to those that have been trained to assess it, right?
That's exactly right. And recognizing what's different in your view. I've known Stacy for 15 years, and the last 6 weeks, she's not been herself.
Right.
This is why. And that's not ratting on somebody. That's understanding there might be something emotionally, something in your life or whatever that's going on. And at the very least, we're going to get somebody some treatment or an intervention or whatever. And then sometimes we might be could very well be saving multiple lives. I love your point you talked about losing the information. And we have time and again seen, particularly in school shootings, we've had persons of interest that intervention strategies were in fact working, and they leave the community or they graduate and they pop back up later. So that's a gap that we're working on within the threat assessment and threat management community, kind of what that looks like. Another factor that we're seeing more and more is self-radicalization. When I first joined the government, it was the world of transnational terrorisms and the Red Brigade and the Baader-Meinhof gang and all those sorts of things. And the Berlin Wall was still up. Cold War was still alive and well. And so what we've seen now is a resurgence of some of these similar concerns with the internet, with social media. Let's say you're a troubled teen and you need help more than anything else, but you have these violent ideations, violent thoughts. And you turn to the internet and get into a chat group of 1,500 of like-minded individuals, 1,499 of which wouldn't ever do one of these things because there's courage in being online and telling other people what to do. But the one person is listening to that and becomes empowered to do things. So that's another thing. Social media now is a best practice when I'm consulting with clients. What's that person's social media background? What are they saying about the company? What are they saying about themselves? Another thing to keep in mind is there's a fine line between suicidal ideation and homicidal ideation.
Can you explain?
Sure. So just I can't imagine because I'm not suicidal and happily I've never been. But to make that difficult decision to take your own life, that things are so desperate, you don't feel you have an option, it's not a big leap after that to harm others. Not always, but we have to be careful. That's why when we partner with clients, suicidal ideation is considered yet another form of workplace violence, because we have to pay attention to that, right? And so that's why so many of these active assailant cases are actually murder-suicides when you think about that, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's the murder first, followed by the suicide. But nonetheless, it's that blurry line, and we just need to recognize and understand that. And domestic violence is another factor that has evolved over time. And the reality of it is that upwards of 50, 60% of active assailant cases can be tied into domestic violence in some way, shape, or form.
Which that's huge, right?
Yeah, it is.
That's huge, and that kind of takes us back to the very start of all this is looking for those behaviors of concern.
Right.
Can you give us some examples of what some of those are, and what exactly are we looking for? You mentioned the change in behavior, right? If all of a sudden, I've been acting, kind of different than my normal steady line behavior, something is going on, right? That change indicates that something is definitely taking place.
Yeah, particularly if you know of the individual, or they work for you, or they're in your community, or sometimes even in your family. What is what we call their steady state behavior? What's Stacy like normally? Good, bad, or indifferent? Not judging, but
Yeah, so maybe if I have a temper and I'm quick to snap, and that's my steady state behavior, that's my steady state behavior.
Yeah, so
right?
I mean, and the reality is violence or anger is a consistent behavior. So if you've been angry your whole life, you're no more likely to commit a violent act than anybody else, just based upon that. But if you've become that way over time, injustice collecting, taking on your and other people's grievances, isolation, violent thoughts, these types of things, anger management issues. When you put them all together, now we have something that we need to talk about. And something is definitely going on with that person. Doesn't mean they're going to be the next active assailant, but it does mean oftentimes when you see an active assailant, I want everybody to understand, when you see that on the evening news, there are certain behaviors of concern that we either missed or left unchecked. They don't wake up.
People just didn't know what to do about it.
Yeah, and
right?
far be it from me to burst your bubble, my friend, but people don't just snap.
Right.
It's an evolutionary process with what we call signposts along the way in that regard. So recognizing that is extremely important. And oftentimes these things can be mitigated by treatment, by leave, by lots of different things. Intervention strategy. And that's the key, right?
Right, yeah. And the reason why I brought that up about the schools and having threat management teams, I had firsthand experience to that. One day, and it was shortly after starting at CPPS here, I get a call from my daughter's assistant principal. Hey, your daughter reported something. And I'm like, okay, well, what happened? And he's like, well, there was this girl in her PE class, and she said that she's going to come to school tomorrow and shoot up the school. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this isn't just a little incident. You got to be kidding me. What are you doing about it? And he goes, don't worry about it. We've reported it to our threat management team and they're investigating it. And I'm like, you have a threat management team? And he's like, yeah, it's actually the law that we have a threat management team. And about a half a day goes by and he calls me back and he's like, come to find out, she just got transferred to this school. She just transferred to a different foster family, and she was having troubles at home, seeking attention. And I'm like, are you sure? And he's like, yeah, no kidding. Like, we have investigated this and we have all these factors that go into it. And he goes, but it was incredible that your daughter came forward. And I'm like, okay, but it wasn't right. It was kind of false alarm. He's like, no. When we investigated it, there were about a dozen other kids in that class that heard the same exact thing, and only one came forward. And I was like, oh my gosh. So having these conversations with your family, with your communities, with your neighbors, with your workforce, I mean, all of this is that empowerment, right? I mean, because what if?
And she's an upstander. You should be very proud of that. She's not a bystander.
Yeah, well, and that's what I found really fascinating about that is, I'm like, it's not like she, jumped on a grenade in Afghanistan here. Like, what? Right. And they're just like, it's just incredible that she had, the wherewithal to come forward and all this. And again, it's just about, even if you're wrong, still allowing that individual to feel empowered. And it's not like, oh, you made a mistake and you kind of feel bad and guilty, but it's like, no, you did the right thing by coming forward and giving it to the professionals and letting us assess it. And regardless, this girl did need intervention. She had trouble at home and there were other things going on. So, I mean, that intervention is, you're just helping other individuals as well. So it's not,
what a great positive story that is, Stacy. And one of my pet peeves in the discipline is we don't spend enough time talking about successes.
Right.
Blowing our own horn. Now, some of it is confidential. It's very touchy. We get that. But if we stop somebody from the abyss, we have to find a way to communicate that to the community.
Right.
Because that empowers them to understand that these kind of things can and will make a difference. I always think about the person that put an awful thing on her Facebook. It was so long ago that we were still calling it the wall on there, and it was. And the client did little or nothing about it and didn't get me involved. For several days later, they dodged a significant bullet, which is probably not very punny, but in reality, because she said she was going to shoot up the place, only come to find out she had a chronically ill child, and she was acting out because she was afraid they were going to terminate her, and so goes her health care. So when you that's another thing. That's why we pay so much attention to how you hire people, how you treat them while they're with you, and how you separate them or fire them. So these are, you can have some success stories, but you don't know if you don't have that information-driven system all the way.
Yeah, because so often, I mean, as a society, we hear people talk about, I'm afraid to even go to a concert or a shopping mall or the grocery store or whatever. But it's like, if we all now are getting this knowledge, creating this awareness, having situational awareness in our day-to-day life, and having these conversations and not making it such a taboo topic, that's how we all become part of the solution. Right?
It was interesting. The basic training I had for that was being in the Foreign Service and being responsible for the lives of people that were assigned overseas. I've been given briefings for an awful long time. It was about terrorism. It was about crime. But you know what? It's analogous. It's the same type of stuff. Be aware of your surroundings. Have a plan. Report to us. Stay out of harm's way. So it's kind of funny how my personal journey has gone full circle. And the fact that we're passing this message on through CPPS to other organizations is just absolutely awesome to me.
Yeah, well, and that comes through in all of your training and all of your scenarios. I mean, just that knowledge and information. I mean, you have to kind of live through this career to be able to pass that on. But it is so incredibly important. And so I really appreciate you sharing that insight with us here today. There's been a lot of lessons learned here. So
yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you so much.